Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are diving straight into a mind-bending historical mystery that completely blurs the line between ancient history and a modern true crime investigation. I am absolutely thrilled to unpack this one with you because we're looking at a case where the physical evidence is so perfectly preserved, it literally feels like it's speaking to us from across millennia. So let's jump right in and see what secrets a seemingly impossible crime scene can actually reveal.
Picture this. You're a police investigator, right? You get called out to a remote, muddy location because workers just uncovered human remains. Specifically, a torso with arms still attached, but missing its head and lower half. The skin is dark and leathery, but incredibly, the fingerprints and the lines on the palms are completely intact. In fact, they are so pristine that your initial assessment is that this person was murdered a mere 4 days ago. You're thinking you have a fresh, brutal homicide on your hands.
But actually scratch that. Here's where the story gets absolutely wild. When investigators sent tissue samples off to the lab for radiocarbon dating, the results completely blew the modern murder theory right out of the water. The body wasn't 4 days old, it wasn't 4 years old. The man had been dead for 2,400 years. We are talking about a victim from the Iron Age, and yet his body remained practically frozen in time, waiting 2 millennia to tell us his story.
A chilling bog discovery. So let's go back to June 2003. Workers were simply out clearing a remote peat bog in central Ireland, near a place called Croghan Hill, when they spotted those human arms. The visceral nature of the crime scene was genuinely shocking. Because the remains were so incredibly well preserved, police initially taped off and secured the area just like any standard modern crime scene. They had absolutely no idea they were stepping into an ancient time capsule. They brought in pathologist Richard Shepard, a guy with over 20 years of experience, to examine the remains. He took one look and immediately concluded that this individual did not die peacefully. The forensic evidence clearly showed that the decapitation and the severing of the lower torso were deliberate, forceful acts committed after death. This was a targeted, horrific end for whoever this nameless victim was.
Section 2. Profiling an Ancient King. Now, let's look at the physical profile of this guy, who experts dubbed Old Croghan Man. He was an absolute giant in his society. They calculated his exceptional height at a staggering 6 feet 6 inches tall. Keep in mind, the average man back then was only 5 feet 5 inches. Plus, his hands had absolutely zero calluses, and his fingernails were clean and professionally manicured. He literally never worked a day of hard manual labor in his life. He was highly muscular, and he wore a braided leather armlet decorated with copper clips, which was an extremely expensive piece of jewelry linked to sun worship. All of this proves he was a super high-status member of society, for sure an elite religious leader or even an ancient Irish king.
Here's the fascinating thing about Iron Age Ireland. The people didn't leave behind any written records. We don't have journals, scrolls, or ledgers to tell us about Old Croghan Man's life or his kingdom. In the total absence of writing, his preserved flesh, his bones, and his possessions serve as our only historical document. We basically have to read his body like a textbook.
Section 3. Forensics of a Ritual Murder.
Before we get into the grisly details of his injuries, we kind of need to understand how this evidence survived in the first place through something called bog preservation. Unlike Egyptian mummies, which were intentionally dried out by people, bogs offer a completely natural mummification process. It's a crazy chemical mix of highly acidic water and rotting sphagnum moss that essentially tans human skin exactly like leather. It perfectly halts decomposition, freezing pre-death injuries and forensic clues exactly as they were 2,400 years ago.
And because of that amazing preservation, pathologists could literally reconstruct this ritualistic execution step by step. First, holes were pierced straight through his elbows, and twisted ropes of wood were threaded through to bind his arms tightly. And get this, fragments of that wood were actually still preserved inside the elbow wounds. Next, the angle of a massive cut on his neck tells us he was forced down onto his knees and stabbed viciously from behind. And finally, in this completely bizarre and highly specific act of mutilation, his left nipple was surgically sliced off.
Section 4. The Missing Nipple Mystery.
Okay, I really want you to think about this for a second. Why on earth would killers deliberately slice off a victim's nipple? A fatal stab wound? Yeah, that makes sense for an execution. Dismemberment? Sure, that makes sense if you want to hide a body. But surgically removing a nipple? That isn't just murder, that's a message. It points us directly toward a ritualistic motive.
Well, as it turns out, Old Croghan Man wasn't an isolated incident. Just miles away, in County Meath, another bog body was discovered that exact same year. Experts named him Clonny Cavan Man.
Now look at the similarities. Both are from the Iron Age, both are preserved in bogs, both are missing their lower halves, and bizarrely both victims had their left nipple cleanly sliced off, the exact same signature mutilation. This proves beyond a doubt that we aren't just looking at a random murder. We are looking at a coordinated serial ritual carried out by the exact same society.
And here is the massive historical payoff to this mystery. While the Iron Age folks didn't write things down, later historical figures absolutely did. Texts written by St. Patrick roughly 900 years later reveal this incredibly grim cultural rule. In ancient Ireland, surgically removing an Irish king's nipples was the official, ceremonial way to strip him of his royal power and status. You see, sucking a king's nipples was an actual traditional gesture of submission back then. So by removing them, the killers ensured these men could never rule again, not in this life and not in the afterlife. Our old Krogan man was definitively a dethroned ancient Irish king.
Section 5. Climate change and starvation.
You know, bogs aren't just preservers of bodies. They are basically giant atmospheric time capsules. A bog grows in layers, kind of like a really muddy layer cake. Every 12 years, 1 centimeter of bog forms, trapping whatever pollen and plant matter happens to be floating in the air. So, to see what the world was like 2,400 years ago, experts simply dug exactly 2 meters deep and extracted the trapped ancient pollen. They wanted to see what the environment looked like right when old Krogan man was killed.
So, what did that 2-meter-deep pollen actually reveal? Well, under the microscope, experts saw a massive sudden shift to a really cold, incredibly damp climate. There was a total absence of agricultural crop pollen, none. It was replaced entirely by a super high concentration of wild weed pollen. This paints a terribly dire picture. The crops had completely failed. The kingdom was suffering from catastrophic climate change, which led to widespread starvation and absolute panic.
Now, to make sense of this, we have to understand the immense, really unimaginable pressure put on an Iron Age monarch. Ancient Irish kings were not just political leaders. They were seen as divine conduits. They were held personally responsible for the weather, the harvest, and the overall prosperity of their land. When the climate shifted and the crops failed, it wasn't viewed as just a run of bad luck. It was viewed as the king utterly failing in his divine duty. A poor harvest was quite literally a death warrant.
Section 6. A monarch's final meal. There is this incredibly tragic contrast hidden right inside the forensics. By looking at the debris trapped under his perfectly manicured fingernails, scientists figured out that weeks before he died, old Krogan man was eating a rich, high-protein meat diet, exactly what you'd expect a wealthy king to eat. But the autopsy of his stomach contents revealed his actual final meal, plain bread and buttermilk. A massive, stark departure from his usual luxury, dropping him straight down to basic peasant rations.
And this drastic diet shift is the missing puzzle piece that brings the whole forensic narrative together. It strongly suggests that he was formally dethroned, held captive, and totally stripped of his royal luxuries before his execution. He almost certainly knew he was brutally destined for sacrifice. And suddenly, those wooden ropes threaded through his elbows make perfect sense. He didn't just go willingly into that bog. He fought back with all of his 6'6" strength, and his captors had to tightly bind this giant of a fallen king to complete their grim ritual.
It's literally an astonishing story. Ancient forensics bringing a forgotten monarch back to life, just to explain his violent, tragic end. And it leaves us with a pretty heavy question as we wrap up this explainer. In ancient times, the ruler paid the ultimate, brutal price for shifting weather patterns and environmental disaster. But today, when crisis strikes, who truly pays the price for the changing of the climate? Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. Stay curious, keep seeking out the facts, and we'll see you in the next explainer.